Good morning. Good morning, distinguished panelists, scholars, dean, and all the audience both in this room and those who are watching our Facebook Live. Welcome to the Lajula seminar on Buddhism and Constitutional Law in Asia. My name is Tina Tingamnoid. I'm Assistant Dean for Academic Affairs. First, let me briefly introduce our panelists. It is our honor to welcome, starting from Professor Dr. Tom Ginsburg from University of Chicago, Professor Dr. Benjamin Schonthal from University of Otago, and Dr. Kem Tong Tonsakun Rung from Faculty of Political Science,ฬาลงกรณ์ University. And the seminar will be further commented by Dr. Chris Baker from Journal of Siam Society. This seminar will be moderated by our faculty member, Assistant Professor Dr. Ravin Lila Patana. Before we start the seminar, may I invite Assistant Professor Dr. Parina Siwanit, the Dean of Faculty of Law,ฬาลงกรณ์ University, to give a welcome remark.
Thank you ค่ะอาจารย์ดร.ทิตินันท์เต็งอำนวย the Assistant Dean to the Academic Affairs Professor Tom Ginsburg Professor Benjamin Schonthal Dr. Chris Baker distinguished speakers ladies and gentlemen on behalf of the Faculty of Law จุฬาลงกรณ์ University I am delighted to welcome all of you to our faculty and to this event, the Law Jula Academic Seminar on Buddhism and Constitutional Law in Asia. Today, we are very honored to have the spearhead of this very exciting topic, the very person who co-founded the studies of the interplay between the Buddhism and Constitutional Law, Professor Tom Ginsburg and Professor Benjamin Schonthal, sharing the panel with Jula's Dr. Kem Tong Tonsakun Rung and our faculty member, Assistant Professor Dr. Ravin Lila Patana. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. Ladies and gentlemen, for some of us and many of those out there, the very issue of how can the two disciplines cross paths between Buddhism and constitutional law is very interesting. And I'm not a constitutional law person, but I have the following questions that should and to what extent Buddhism influenced constitutional reform in the Buddhism majoritarian countries like Thailand, and at the same time, does the public and constitutional law in turn have influence over how the Buddhist institution is run? And when we teach constitutional law, do current doctrines and models adequately explain the dynamics between Buddhism and constitutional law? The answers to these questions probably could find in the book and as well as on the panel today. So ladies and gentlemen, this seminar is is the remark of this intersection between Buddhism and constitutional. And I would like to once again thank you, the distinguished guests, and especially Professor Ravin, who hosting this panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dean Parina. Before starting the seminar, I may invite the panelists, the commentators, and the moderator to have a group photo with Dean Parina. You can stay on the stage. And we'll move up for you. Thank you. So now we pass the floor to Dr. Robin. Okay, thank you.
ขอบคุณครับก็ once again good morning to all and welcome to today's seminar and our main focus of today's seminar is on the book Buddhism and Comparative Constitutional Law recently published by Cambridge University Press and our presentation today will proceed as follows. In the first round, I would like to ask Ajahn Tom and Ajahn Ben, to speak why the project is so important, and then I will ask Kem Tong, to present his own chapter, and each will have 15 minutes, to present their works, and then I will invite Ajahn Chris to give some comments. This should take approximately 20 minutes, and then in the second round, each participant, each author, will have 10 minutes to respond to Ajahn Chris' comments. So first, I would like to ask Ajahn Tom and Ajahn Ben to present, to speak why the project is so important and how does it, contribute to, the study in the field of constitutional law as a whole. Thank you.
ขอบคุณครับ สวัสดีครับ and thank you so much for having us here. This is a wonderful opportunity and very exciting to talk about this project here at Chulalongkorn. Until I think, recently, gatherings like this would be very unusual. So when Tom and I have been invited to speak at universities about this topic, we often draw from law faculties and from Buddhist studies or sociology faculties, and in a lot of cases, these groups of scholars don't even know each other. And I think this says something about the state of the field of Buddhism and constitutional law, but also the potential for the field, both as a topic of research and as an instrument for thinking more broadly about the role of law in the world and the various scholars who can contribute at universities. Now, the fact that this topic has not received attention definitely has something to do with disciplinary lines of sight and disciplinary biases. So I was trained in Indology and classical Buddhist studies. I was trained in Pali and Buddhist history, textual history, and as someone trained in that tradition, I can say that for many people in Buddhist studies, constitutional law is not a topic that is worthy of discussion. That when you do talk about law in Buddhist studies, what we mean is mainly Vinaya, and for slightly more enlightened people, other forms of textual, historical traditions, generally before the 19th century. That is what the study of Buddhist law or Buddhism and law might entail in Buddhist studies. Now, comparative constitutional law, we know, has also had its own well-documented biases, a preference for normative approaches, a preference for European and Euro-American examples. And so in a way, this project brushes up against all these disciplinary tendencies on both sides of the ledger. So how did we end up here? Well, I think the story of this book actually begins, about a decade or so ago when Tom and I just happened to meet by chance on the campus of the University of Chicago. I was finishing my PhD, Tom was teaching in the law school, I was writing about the history of Sri Lankan law and kind of South and Southeast Asian law more generally, and I decided to go and meet him, and it turned out that he also had an interest in Buddhism. And from those initial conversations, we, I think, planted the seed or hatched the idea even then, wouldn't it be cool to bring our expertise together and write something about Buddhism and law? And so, this book is kind of a story of this chance or this, maybe this karma that's finally come to fruition after all this time. Our work has been guided and inspired by others who have written about Buddhism and law, Frank Reynolds, Rebecca French, David Engel, among others, Andrew Harding. But what we were trying to do here is to really fill a particular need, we think, in the study of comparative constitutional law and in the study of Buddhism. right? That you can't understand modern Buddhism without understanding the dominant form of legal regulation in most states in the world, which is the Constitution, and you can't understand modern constitutional law in this part of the world, but I would suggest in a global way, without understanding something about Buddhism. Right? And we have these traditions of studying Islam and constitutional law, or Christianity and constitutional law. Why not something about Buddhism? So we applied for a grant with the National Science Foundation. We were very lucky to get it, and we thought, great, we'll have a conference in 2020. And then COVID. And so our in-person conference we had to kind of move laterally a little bit. And we were able to build it out into a kind of a more interesting set of conversations. So we jointly taught a class at the law school, at the University of Chicago Law School, a virtual class on Buddhism and constitutional law. And we concurrently ran a workshop series for scholars around the world. It was a fortnightly workshop series where we'd take a different given jurisdiction, 2 scholars would present on the jurisdiction, and then we'd have a conversation. And that ran from about January to May 2020. And it was a singular and fantastic experience. So when Tom and I got together, and when we started having these conversations in these contexts, it seemed even more shocking to us that nothing had been done on this topic before. And we were able to see a little bit more clearly the importance of this kind of project. So just to give you an example, there is not a single jurisdiction in South and Southeast Asia today in which, or I would say in all of most of Asia today, that has not at some point in history been a major site for Buddhism, right? And had major Buddhist legal traditions present in it. And if we look just purely at the contemporary South and Southeast Asian situation, of the 6 countries with majority Buddhist populations in this region, all of them give special protections to Buddhism in the Constitution, right? So we wanted to think, but we wanted to think about this in more holistic ways. We wanted to think about constitutional law and constitutionalism as projects that are entwined with Buddhist actors, ideas, and institutions, in which constitutional law was in which the actors were not just judges, but monks and nuns, in which fundamental rights were not the main, and other constitutional rubrics were not the main categories of investigation, but also dharma and karma. In which we wanted to look at the ways in which constitutional law in Asia is being shaped not just in legislatures, but in monasteries. And so the book basically explores this intimacy. And the word that we use, the phrase that we use to describe this intimacy is this maybe slightly cumbersome phrase, the Buddhist constitutional complex. That's what we're calling our object of study. And we chose this term because we think it communicates an intimacy between these 2 traditions without implying that they're somehow naturally separable or that there's somehow some single way in which they relate, right? That the book highlights a number of complex modes of interaction and merger. So some chapters, for example, those chapters on Korea by Mark Nathan, on Tibet by Mills and Jansen, on Southeast Asia by Lammertz, they show us examples of that Buddhist history has its own traditions of written constitutions and constitutionalism as a political philosophy. There are monastic constitutions, such as this Chaik in Tibet or Kathikavata in Sri Lanka, and there are also ideas of government limited by law in Buddhist history. Secondly, other chapters show us how Buddhist actors and ideas influence modern national constitutions, right? There are stories of Buddhist-minded lawmakers like J.R. Jayawardena in Sri Lanka or U Nu in Myanmar, or stories of monastic activists, all of whom are actively engaged in reshaping constitutional texts, but also constitutional jurisprudence in accordance with Buddhist ideas. Kem and Eugenie's chapters are just beautiful examples of this kind of thing. And thirdly, I think there are chapters in this book that illustrate how modern constitutions, as a set of ideals and textual forms, have influenced Buddhism and Buddhist settings. Right? So for example, a great example, Levi McLaughlin gives us a great example of the case in Japan of Soka Gakkai. And Soka Gakkai has basically been heavily influenced by the Japanese national constitution in its own, what he would call mimetic constitutions that they have as an organization, but also in a series of holidays in which Soka Gakkai actually shows deference for the national constitution in a kind of a Buddhist idiom. So it's this really complex set of interactions. It's neither merger nor hybrid, but this messy amalgam that we're looking to analyze. And I think I'll just leave it there.
Thank you. I'll add my thanks to everyone for coming and say just a few more words about what we are doing in the book and also what we're not doing in the book, because it really is just a very initial project, and there's so much more work to do. And I just encourage, students who are interested in really doing, deep scholarship. There's no better place to study these things than Chula, because of Ajahn Kem, Ajahn Rawin. There's a lot of good young scholars here in Thailand working on exactly these issues. So, but there's a lot of questions. So what we'll do is I'll say a little bit about what we're doing, what we're not doing, and then turn to Ben to articulate the future questions for research that might be looked at. So one thing about this is that it's a socio-legal project. That is, it's not a normative project. And I'll say what I mean by that. But our method was kind of like what we'd say inductive. There's all these different countries in Asia. Some, as Ben mentioned, are majority Buddhist, and 6 of the 7 majority Buddhist countries place Buddhism in the constitution as having some higher status. The only one which doesn't is Mongolia, which is majority Buddhist. But then even in societies which are not majority Buddhist, Vietnam, China, Japan, Korea, you see, and Taiwan is a strange mix of religions and such, very vital place for religion, but you see so much influence in various ways, and also various treatments by the government of Buddhism, that the variety was interesting. So when you do something, when I use the word inductively, what that means is to go and look at lots of different phenomena and then see what patterns you can see, rather than come with some giant theory and then say this is what's happening. You kind of let the data tell you, let the information kind of come out. And that was basically our approach with this book. We looked at formal constitutions, but also constitutional politics. And Buddhist constitutional politics are really interesting, and sometimes I don't think even scholars of politics understand the Buddhist forces. I'll give 2 examples. One is in Japan. Ben mentioned the Soka Gakkai. As you all know, the Japanese constitution is a peace constitution, prohibits war. And that's something that the ruling party has been trying to change now for 70 years. Even though they've controlled the government for 70 years, they can't change that part of the constitution. Now why? It's very interesting. Well, in the electoral politics, the reason is that this Buddhist political party, the Komeito, has a kind of, they are in alliance with the Liberal Democratic Party, and they don't want to change the constitution. They're Buddhists. They don't want to change the constitution, say war is actually okay. So their Buddhist ideas inform their politics, which informs the constitutional development of Japan, which of course affects all of East Asia. So that's a kind of interesting example of how just a very local Buddhist party can make a big difference. Another example I'll give is, we tend to think of Buddhism as a religion of meditation and peace. But then of course in neighboring Myanmar, Sri Lanka, we sometimes see monks actually leading violence or calling for violence against other groups. And that seems so strange from the outside. And we have some discussion a little bit about why that might be the case, how you could justify in religious terms the need, and in Buddhist terms actually, the need to defend the faith. We don't talk about it much in this book, but I have a theory that we've been discussing that religions are also talking to each other, just like human beings, just like countries and laws, move from one place to another. Religions do too. And sometimes the discourse that we see in Buddhism seems to be directly borrowed from constitutional Islam. Islamic constitutionalism, which has always grappled with this idea of the state versus the faith. Now we see some of the very same language moving into Buddhist context very interestingly, and I think this idea of defending the faith to me seems like something like that. So just very interesting phenomenon. I'll say a couple other things. Which to supplement what Ben said, one of the things we did in the project was we had a lot of Buddhist scholars. Well, let me say one other substantive thing. There's a real mysteries about Buddhist law, in legal history especially, and Ajahn Rawen and several other scholars published a book last year on Thai, and Chris Baker and Ajahn Pasuk actually have a book on Thai legal history, which grapples with some of these questions. And there's kind of a deep mystery in many of these Buddhist societies that we don't really know the answer to, which is how Buddhist was the law, and what was the relationship between the kings in old times and Buddhist Vinaya principles. Well, how did it inform the law as applied to the ordinary citizens? In Europe, we have a lot of scholarship about that. And indeed, the story in Europe is that the development of modern law, which we all live under, really came a lot from the Catholic Church originally, the procedures and things like this, and it's spread out. We don't really know. But there's some debates, and I would just highlight, there's a long-standing debate in Tibetan history over whether the old Tibetan law was really Buddhist or not. Later, people went back and said, no, that's Buddhist law. But was it really? And that's what Tibetologists debate. And Ajahn Pasuk and Ajahn Chris here actually have a chapter in that book on Thai legal history in which they also argue convincingly that, Thailand too, that a lot of the old monarchic law was really monarchic law. It really was sort of law first, and the kings were just making pronouncements in the classic sense. And this is, a live debate in Thai legal history. So I think I'm just raising this to show how we might begin to see common patterns across the Buddhist world that no one has really ever sort of thought about because the common questions arise. Let me turn to what we're not doing in the book. We don't try to answer the question of why there is no category of Buddhist law. I mean, Westerners, we know there's Islamic law, there's Jewish law, there's canon law, there's Hindu law. No one's really written much on Buddhist law, and that's kind of interesting. My own theory about it, which is not articulated here, but has to do with the lack of a truly unified Buddhist empire in the relatively modern period. The Roman Empire is what gives us Western law, ultimately. Unifies everything in a kind of concept of law and a grammar that then sticks around for a couple thousand years. And although we have localized Buddhist empires, Ashoka and stuff, nothing that would ever reach the entire Buddhist world. Plus the pluralism, when you're talking about the Vajrayana tradition, the Tibetan tradition, and the Northern tradition, it's just very, very different. So it's hard to imagine a coherent category. And yet maybe there is something there, but we don't really explore that question. Another thing we do not do is provide, I guess I would call it a normative theory of Buddhist constitutionalism. That is, we now have very active debates in the United States by conservatives who believe our country is a Christian country, that how to bring back Christianity into informing our Constitution, saying our Constitution really should advance these values. And we don't provide a theory of what a true Buddhist Constitution would look like. It's far beyond my capacity, I think. It's not our project. But there are people who have started to talk about it. Ajahn Sulak here has written some things on this. The Dalai Lama has written a little bit on it. And I think that's an interesting, thing we're not trying to do, but, and that's because we're socio-legal. We're starting inductively and working just with what the facts are as near as we can tell, rather than kind of saying, what should the Constitution be if we want to be governed by Buddhist principles? I guess a third thing we're not doing is providing a true and uniform definition of Buddhist constitutionalism. What exactly that means. It's more, as Ben said, a complex, kind of a lot of relationships, but not a single unity. So that means there's much more to do. Before turning back to him to explain what we should do, I want to say one other thing that we did do, though, which is we decided to include after we did this conference and class over many weeks, we included scholars from who study other religions, an Islamic law scholar, someone who studies India, Hindu law, and someone who studies the canon law, the old law of the Catholic Church. And that was just very interesting, I think, to kind of see how parallel historical projects look from the outside, and in a way, how some common questions arise when you have a class of people like the Sangha, which is, specialists in religion, and then ordinary people. When you have that kind of religious structure, like the Islam has this idea of the scholar, the ulama. So that raises questions, well, who actually decides? How do they internally decide what is going on, and what is the relationship between this kind of elite religious class and the ordinary people? How do ideas spread around and forth? What are those relations? That was an interesting set of things, as well as the grand, and I'll just stop after this, the really big historical question. If we think that Western law emerged from religious law, then what about Asian law? And this is the question we just don't know the answer to, because the records are so thin on the ground about what was actually happening. The records in Asia were written on palm leaves and things like this, not carved into stone tablets. And so the records are just poor. But we, as scholars, can try to do what we can to try to kind of see whether those stories are the same or different, and then why. Back to you.
Thanks, Tom. Actually, Tom really covered a lot of where I was kind of going to head, but said it much more clearly and nicely than me. So I may just make one other brief question and then open it up to the rest of the panel, who we're very keen to hear from, which is just to maybe double down on this last issue of the tradition. I think there's a really important question here about, is there a tradition of Buddhist constitutionalism that emerges in the region and speaks into or merges with or intersects with or co-develops with Western forms of constitutional law that it's possible to identify either in a local context, either the Thai version, say, or in a regional context? I mean, is there a Theravada constitutionalism? And then if so, what is the Harold Berman story? What is of that? Harold Berman, Law and Revolution, this basically the story that all of the Western legal form comes out of a certain crisis in the Catholic Church. Is there a Harold Berman story in the Theravada Buddhist world? I think there's possibility of certain candidates for that. What would the Robert Cover story be? What would the Nomos and Narrative story be about Buddhist law in Theravada regions? What are the sort of juris-generative and juris-pathic potentials that you could see in this Theravada tradition that are maybe unique from other traditions? So I think that's a live question that I hope that this book kind of provokes, and I hope it kind of maybe generates some further research projects along those lines. I think I might just leave it there and thank the rest of the panelists, and looking forward to their comments.
Thank you very much, Tom and Ben. So next, I would like to pass the stage to Ajahn Mtong, to present his chapter on Thai Buddhist constitutional law. Thank you.
Thank you very much, distinguished guests. Thank you very much. Again, the Faculty of Law for inviting me on this panel. So I'm one of the authors who contribute a chapter on Thailand into this wonderful book. And this chapter intertwined pretty much with my PhD, which is a work on Buddhist constitutionalism. When I first tell the dean, not Dean Parina, the other dean, that I applied for scholarship, I want to study PhD on Buddhist and law, and he was unimpressed. Obviously, he's like, you want to go to a monk university and lecture to monks. I think that's the first thing when you say Buddhism and law, and people tend to think of monks and law, or law on monks or something. Like you're gonna be an expert on กฎหมายพระสงฆ์ which is like a million light years away from what I intended to study. Anyhow, so that's the beginning of my PhD journey, and I think that's coincide with a lot of development in Thai legal studies. I think young scholars in my generation, we all shift from a doctrinal study of law into a more like a software side of law. I mean, we look at legal concise, we look at cultural aspect of law, and we ask the question of what dictates our application of law in such a way that is so illiberal, that is so authoritarian. And I'm part of that. And when I start with Buddhism and law, what I notice is that it seems like there used to be a peak of study of, well, not Buddhism and law is like in a stricter sense, but Buddhism and politics in Southeast Asia. In Thailand in particular, there's great works of like Yoneo Ishii, Frank Reynolds, Peter Jackson. But it's all like peaked and died out a couple of years before I start my interest in Buddhism and law. But at the very same time that I start doing my PhD, that's when the interest in Buddhism and law start picking up again. And I think this time, from my personal experience, it's something to do with Rohingya crisis in Myanmar, that the world start focusing on the Buddhist role into fueling that crisis. Anyway, so it became my work on Buddhist constitutionalism. So I look at Buddhist political philosophy on politics, constitutional politics of Thailand. And then I got invited to this book. I think we met, not in that nice Italian like that inaugural meeting in Italy, but we met in New York, which in upstate New York, which is a wonderful place with Rebecca French and everyone else, and that's just amazing because that's the first time I met like actual scholars who work on Buddhism and contemporary law. I mean, usually when you look at Buddhism and law, people refer back to ancient law or monastery law. They work on a scripture in Tibetan Buddhist monastery in the 14th century. So something that's like very distant away, but that conference, that workshop in Buffalo, and I met someone who really works on all this. That's wonderful. And then COVID. So we didn't meet. Anyway, we finished. And I focus on constitution. It's by my training, I work a lot on constitutional law, and I still want to keep on doing that. So that's first thing that what I try to do with this chapter. I want to go beyond that ancient monastic law or the Sangha law of Thailand into constitution, and argue that, I mean, we tend to think of a constitution and most of Thai legal system as being imposed on us by necessity in the turn of the 20th century, and it's a Western import. So we have always been taught that our codified legal system come from Germany, we come from France. There's all a French scholar, there's Belgian scholar, there's Japanese scholars who help us drafting a code under the guidance of Prince Damrong and Prince Rapi, for example. But I want to challenge that. I mean, especially looking at the current constitutional crisis in Thailand. We talk a lot about judicial activism, ตุลาการพิวัตร in Thai politics. And I mean, superficially, you know that this is a trend in the constitutional world, that the rise of the judiciary. There's a book on juristocracy. There's a book on post-political constitution, judicialization of politics, politicization of the judiciary, and superficially you are convinced that this is part of the global movement, so we just part of it. But is that all? And my assumption is no. Actually, there's some local elements at work with it too. I mean, That's my first assumption. The second assumption is that we often blame a coup for the rise of conservatisms and moralisms in Thailand. And I think that's easy because a coup represents the conservative faction in Thailand. The coup is always the conservatives' choice of solution to political crisis and a means to create another one. But anyways, we often blame the coup as representing a more traditional thoughts, political thoughts and ideology. But looking back, and I realized that even at our best democratic moments in the 1997, actually there's a lot of indigenous ideas at work. And this is very personal because I used to work with a lot of constitutional scholars who helped draft the 1997 constitution, and they exhibit a very interesting trait. I mean, on one hand, they talk about the French constitutional law, they talk about constitutional court, and they go to, they study in abroad, they do PhD abroad, they go to like ENA, École Nationale Administrative, they are Westernly educated. But at the same time, they exhibit another extreme of being super religious when they talk about good and bad, they talk about morality. It's like super indigenous idea within them, and they tend to exhibit these like two polars together. But, and this is a big but because I work with them from 2007 onward. The but is that the more traditional indigenous Buddhist side of them was starting to overcome a more Western part. So I know that even when they draft the 1997 constitution, there's certain Buddhist idea that inspire them, driving them at work, and that's how I construct my chapter on Thai constitution as a battle between Barami, the Buddhist concept of power, and the voice of the people, Vox Populi, which is a cornerstone of democracy. And I would say I'm quite pleased with that because finally I move away from, as I say, Vinaya. I move away from a usual theme of Buddhism and contemporary law too. I mean, a lot of people focus on kingship, Buddhist kingship. And I mean, nothing wrong with Buddhist kingship. I mean, it's relevant, but it's not like we have the king and the rest is the serf. I mean, it's more like a pyramid where you have the king at the top of that Barami pyramid hierarchy. But you also have people below, like there are certain stratas below. And I want to focus on that middle level people. They are operative who help maintain this unfree and unfair political arrangement. And argue that all this Buddhist concept is not only applicable to the king, it's applicable to other people as well. You look at Barami, we know that the king is the most Barami person in Thai political hierarchy, but also the concept of Barami is applicable to someone else too. Pumi Barami, yeah, the king is Pumi Barami, like the one who owns or possesses Barami. But Chao Po, local godfathers, local mafias, or high-ranking bureaucrats. You talk to any Atipadi or the minister, and they are called like they are Barami as well. So I try to look into a more secular and non-monarchy people, a group of people. So look at the court and all those unelected elites. I mean, again, the same theme. Right? When we start drafting 1997 Constitution, we adopt this fourth branch of power from Taiwan Constitution, from South African Constitution, those fourth branch, Electoral Commission and National Anti-Commissions. But at the same time, the way we decide it, the way we never impose any strong accountability upon these unelected agencies. It's very telling because the selection the process of selection, the process of accountability rely almost principally on the assumption that after the vetting we get only good people, คนดี and we won't impose much check on them. We just rely on their own moralities to guide their exercise of power, and that's the seed of the conflict, of the current conflict. I mean, we look at 2006, 2007 as the watershed moment, but actually the seed of the conflict has already been sown many years before that. So that's the gist of my work in this. I mean, there's still questions that I haven't had time to answer. I used COVID as an excuse. I was writing in rush. No, but like relationship between like barami and bun, what's the difference and stuff like that. But that's for later. I mean, I believe this is just a beautiful beginning of the journey, maybe. Okay, so back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ajahn Kem Tong. We have learned a lot, from your chapter about, the inextricable relationship between Buddhism and, Thai constitutionalism. So now I would like to pass the stage to Ajahn Chris to give comments for all the presenters. Thank you.
First, thank you. Thank you very much to Ajahn Kem Tong and Ajahn Rawin for inviting me to comment on this simply superb book, because while reading it, quite often I had that joyous feeling what you get when you are reading something which you know absolutely nothing about. So everything is pure knowledge. But when you're then asked to comment on it, of course that's slightly more frightening. So when I saw the advertisement for today and discovered I was the only commentator, I'm supposed to talk for 20 minutes, I got a little bit frightened and thought about calling up my travel agent. But although I enjoyed enormously reading the parts of the book which, if you like, on the fringes of the Buddhist world and the non-majoritarian countries, particularly the China, Mongolia and Korea chapters, and they're very interesting, I'm going to talk more about the majoritarian countries, and I'm going to be biased towards the Theravada ones because that's what I know something about. So I'm going to give a few reactions to the book, and they're very scattergun, okay? I'm then going to talk a little bit more about the two Thai articles, two articles on Thailand, because they are, after all, we are in Thailand in that moment. And finally, I've got a question about the context. While reading this book, I, of course, was thinking, why does this big book exist? Why would this group set out on this project? And Tom just now has explained very clearly what you can see is that, it's saying there is this study of the relationship between religion and law and constitutions from the Christian tradition. It's a huge study there. I remember studying this when I was studying European history a long time ago. And of course, more recently, it has been replicated in the Islamic world. And one of the wonderful chapters in the book is Lombardi's chapter about Islam, which is superb. So why not? Why should there not be on Buddhism as well, given that it is a major world religion? But I wondered also if there is a subtext, and if you like, this has just been confirmed. And I wonder if there was a subtext behind the book which is about the issue of violence and the issue of Buddhism and violence. And here I was thinking about the late works of Stanley Tambaya, his anguished work about violence and Buddhism in Sri Lanka. Then, of course, of Myanmar, Mabata, the Rohingya pogroms, but also Thailand right now, where you could say that there has been a significant rise in the level of violence being committed by the state, which is in some ways being justified by Buddhist concepts. More broadly, I think one of the things that is behind this book is the revolution that's taken place in Buddhist studies over the last couple of decades. Not long ago, I contend, it would have been impossible to have written this book without mentioning Max Weber in the first paragraph. But now, with the new writing on Buddhist studies, not only are the texts being read differently from the way they were read by the Pali Text Society a century ago, but the whole study of Buddhism is placing much more attention on practice rather than words, and that's changing a lot. So what I see in the book is that this Buddhist constitutionalism or constitutional Buddhism or whatever is knitting together two things. The first is the part that Ben defined very nicely in his 2017 article, attempts to use written constitutions and other basic laws to organize power in ways that protect and preserve Buddhist teachings and institutions, especially the Sangha. In other words, to use kind of state-like constitutional institutions and structures to help protect Buddhism and the practice of Buddhism now in the future. And this is something that I think a few years ago we would have just called state-Sangha relations. And the second part is the influence of Buddhist concepts on the creation of the supreme law, the constitution, and related institutions for the public good. I think that's a very important part of the definition. And this is something which in the past we might have called Buddhism and politics, but by this clever knitting through the idea of constitution has brought these together in, I think, a very productive way. Now, I'm going to make some scattergun comments, first on the historical part and later on the more modern part. And I must confess, I am biased towards the historical part because that's what I'm interested in, okay? If you think about the Buddhist scriptural tradition, there is very, very little in it about law and politics. We, of course, know from the Akanya Sutta that the famous passages about the Mahasamut, the great elect. But if you look at it, it's just a handful of lines in that, and it's not actually the main point of that sutta. And of course, there's the chapter in the Draipum, in the Three Worlds, about the wheel-rolling emperor. And again, it's actually not long, very long, and it's basically descriptive. You know, there's not much kind of theory going on behind there. It's simply descriptive of the emperor. And in, I think, the Theravada world, there is no tradition, no encouragement for philosophizing from the scriptures up to new ideas. Hence, there's really no tradition of what we might think of as political philosophy or legal philosophy. And there's no real tradition of a law above law, a law above the king, a law above the man in general. You can't find this sort of thing in the discourse. But of course, politics is constituted in some way in all societies with contributions from concepts and ideas. So what role does Buddhism have in this process? One thing I thought was missing from the book in the parts that did address history was any awareness of the different context of Buddhism or religion in general between the present and the past. Buddhism today is very much about worship, about merit-making or fortune, gaining fortune. But in earlier times, and I'm thinking about from the 15th century to the 18th or 19th, Buddhism had a much larger role in the society. the monk was not just the priest. The monk was the teacher, he was the doctor, he was the psychiatrist, and he was the purveyor of fun and entertainment as well, because the major fun parts of the year were the festivals laid on by the Wat. And what came from this embedded nature of the monk was a degree of social power. And this is very different from the kind of silo religion that we see today. You could say that, of course, we all know that, and it's the same for other religions, but I still think it's something that needed to be mentioned. It comes through in Christian Lemert's chapter, where one part of what he is saying is that the influence of Buddhism, if there is one, on the political world, the constitution, is not just coming through key ideas like Dhammasastra, like Dhammaraja, like Chakravartin, or necessarily through the formal law codes, but it's in some ways coming through what we might today call the politics of everyday life. And this, you can see going way back, is that the key, if you like, the key axis of the relationship between Buddhism and politics in these societies is the whole issue of the relationship between the king and the monk, the Wat and the Wang. And this is a very big theme in the history, going back as far as the records go. Now, of course, in the historical sources, this is mostly written from the side of the palace, because the sources are the royal chronicles or the royal laws. And so, of course, the king wins every time. But there are occasional glimpses of another side of this, particularly, most interestingly to me, in the inscriptions that come from Sukhothai. And the metaphor here for power was the relics which the monks brought from Sri Lanka or from Burma, but theoretically from the Buddha's cremation. And they brought them to Siam and to Lanna. And when these relics came, they showed that they were magic. And they showed that they were magic by performing, whizzing around in the air and putting out all kinds of colours and so on. And this can be a metaphor for the potential for supernatural power which the monk can possess. And kings were desperate to be able to control and have access to this power, but the monks denied them. Okay? And these stories, I think, are very, very powerful, very pregnant with ideas. And also what we have in the Sukhothai inscriptions is the story of Sisatta, this man who starts out as a royal and actually as a pretty bloodthirsty warrior prince, and is converted over his life into a monk, to a very compassionate monk, and becomes a major force in the spread of Theravada in Lanna. And in some ways you can read this as a kind of constitutional revolution. He is, if you like, reconstituting kingship from the stance of Buddhism. Now, the kings, as I said, they are desperate to get access to this supernatural power, to something which I will, for simplicity, just call magic. The Sangha, the Buddhism, it needs patronage from the kings. It needs protection. It needs help to defy the inevitable decline of Buddhism predicted over 5,000 years. It needs land for the upkeep of the monastery. It needs tax relief and so on. So this is the basis for entering into delicate negotiations between the king and the monk. And the kings are able to trade their patronage, their support, in order to get access to this magic. And they also, once they have done that, try to impose institutional controls over the monks to prevent them being able to use this magic against them. There is then, in this story, at least in Siam, what I think is one of the great turning points in this story, which is in the early 17th century, in the reign of King Phra-Thong. And he is very much the founder of absolutism in Siam. And he is able to found this absolutism because he's the first very rich king on the basis of trade. But he makes his assertion in a most extraordinary way. He claims that he himself is a reincarnation of the Palalai elephant which attended to the Buddha in the forest, that he himself is a bodhisattva, and he will become the 10th future Buddha after Gautama. And this is simply, quite simply, a royal takeover of magic. Did people believe all this stuff at the time, or did they just think he was a crank? We don't know. But you can see that from this time on, the kings, certainly here, were able to make claims to be magical, if you like, without necessarily requiring the complicity of the monks. Now, I was fascinated while thinking about this, that one of the scholars who has written about history and law in Siam is Michael Vickery, right? And who is strangely almost doesn't make any appearance in the book. Never mind, I don't know. And it fascinated me, of course, that his great article on the law, on the Three Seals Code, is called The Constitution of Ayutthaya. Okay? And you might say that he's using that term as a historian, and he's really just saying that he is able to use these laws as documents in order for himself to construct what he thinks was the constitution of Ayutthaya. But I think there's a little bit more than that is going on here. And I think we can see that from what King Rama I said when he had the Three Seals laws revised in 1805. Because what he said was, he said, I have ordered the revision and the revival of the Tipitaka, the three baskets, the Pali Canon, if you would like, for the purpose of spiritual governance, Putajak. And then I have also ordered the revision and revival of the laws for worldly governance, Anaja. And I think what he is saying here is, this is the constitution. But it's not just one document, it's the whole legal tradition. Let me now just say much more briefly about in the more modern period. It seems to me from reading this book that in this Theravada zone, the acceptance of the idea of a constitution as a law above laws is really very weak. Of course, this is most obvious in Thailand, which has the world record for shredding constitutions. But I think you can also see it in Myanmar, Cambodia, and Sri Lanka, because the pace at which regimes change and zigzag ahead means that they are not being essentially subject to a constant overarching law. And I think this is happening just simply because, first, because these polities are all very new. They have emerged only from the colonial world in the last 50, 80, 100 years. And for the second reason, that the sheer pace of social change defies the attempt to create a constant and abiding law. When you think the way these societies have changed from being rather feudal rural societies to being urban globalized societies in the space of 2 generations, you can see why it's difficult to get constancy. The first aspect of this Buddhist constitutionalism, the state-Sangha relations. It seems to me there is a great continuity from the past. The kings today and the politicians today remain nervous about Buddhism because its potential to mobilize the mass and because also of its claims to magic. Remember that the attempt to control, suppress the Dhammakaya movement did not start because they had heretical ideas. Everyone, that was already well known. It didn't start because they clearly had very funny finances. It started when they made claims to magic, when they claimed to be able to fly in the air. So I think, as the book shows, in this first aspect of state-Sangha relations, all the states are using constitutions and constitution-like documents and institutions to control the Sangha and limit its involvement in politics in very various ways. On the second aspect, the aspect of Buddhism and politics, and Buddhism and its influence on constitutionalism, it seems to me that because constitutions as the supreme law are really not very powerful in these areas, there is rather an arena of political conflict which is rather loosely structured and hence rather wild. The constraints on what the politicians and the rulers are able to do is not coming about through an overarching higher law, but rather through the competition between themselves. And in fact, constitutions, rather than being a supreme law for the public good, rather have tended to become weapons in the political conflict. Or in other words, another way to say it is that constitutions get weaponized, particularly here. Now, just quickly on the two, really splendid articles on Thailand by Ajahn Kem Tong and by Eugénie Mériot. One thing that both of them bring out, I think, is this important confusion in the concept of Tama, Dharma, Tama, whatever we want to pronounce it. That this word has two meanings. On one, it means nature. It means what is. Tama is what is. And of course, turns into Tamachat as well. But the second meaning is it means what is right and what is good. And of course, there's an enormous slipperiness between these two meanings of the word. What Eugénie's article shows is how the royalists have won the battle to deploy constitutions and constitution making over the last 70 or 80 years. They have won that battle on behalf of the institution of monarchy. And they have done that really in two ways. One is, but since 1932, successfully maneuvering the constitutions are presented as a gift of the throne. They don't come from any higher morality or ideology, if you like. They are granted by the king in a rather feudal form. And that in those constitutions, it is the question of whether power rests with the people is fudged. In the earlier constitutions, this was done by using rather fudgy language, but in the later ones, it has come from the formula that power belongs to the people, but is exercised by the king. So the second part of that phrase overrides the first. But what Eugenie also shows is that part of this strategy of the royalists is to argue that power rests on morality and that morality is embodied in monarchy. Now, in fact, this idea was contested quite bitterly in practice for many years, and that the royalists did not always win. And Eugenie tends to leave that part out in order to give her argument greater point, greater simplicity. And in fact, not until the ninth king had acquired the very special quality that goes with age, that goes with longevity, did this close association between monarchy and morality become seemingly unchallengeable. And Ajahn Kemtong has built on that, as he has just very nicely summarized, by showing how the concept of the moral king and the moral nature of power has been broadened beyond the king, beyond the institution of monarchy, to the ability to define certain people as moral people, okay? And to create institutions filled with such people which are technically committed to a moral purpose and therefore unchallengeable. And what has happened as a result of this is the erosion of democratic space, legitimization of authority, and licensing of greater violence. Finally, I'd like to say that as I was reading it, one thing that occurred to me was the book. One of the words that seemed to be missing was compassion. And since I'm reading the electronic version, I can dial up and actually search to see if this was true. In fact, the word appears 15 times, but mostly those are either in the bibliography, just in titles, or in definitions of things like the 10 virtues of kingship, or in historical quotes. It's only used in two places in the arguments of the authors, one in the case of one for Bhutan and the other for Tibet. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ajahn Chris, for your thought-provoking comments. And then I would like to ask, all three authors, to respond to his comments. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ajahn Chris. There was so much there. I'm still digesting. I have pages and pages of notes. Really fantastic comments, and I think very illuminating and a lot for me to think about, a lot for us to think about. One thing that came to mind in your comments, and I think it's something that we all struggled with in the workshops particularly, was thinking about the place of norms. For example, the idea of dharma, as on the one hand, operative ideals, aspirational ideals, and on the other hand, considering, do they actually do work in society? Do they actually limit, does the Dasaraja Dhamma actually limit the behavior of kings, for example, right? So there is a kind of a realist point of view which would say, no, it's, in the same way that all kinds of autocrats around the world pay lip service to the rule of law or constitutional law, but then behave in unlawful ways. So too could this Dasaraja Dhamma do the same thing, and how would we know? And to that question, the answer is really most of what we have before the most of what we have even now are normative texts. So until very recently, until the last 60, 70 years, it's hard to get other documents to assess really what limiting, what kind of constraining roles these ideals would play in society. But I would say that the norms themselves, in terms of my understanding of Southern Asian history, the ideals, things like Mahasamata, like Chakravarti, these ideals, although there may not be a kind of robust tradition of political philosophy or something we would identify as political philosophy in, say, the Tipitaka and its commentaries, I don't actually believe, I actually would disagree with you a little bit and say that in fact these things were very operative as political conceits in the pre-modern period. So in Sri Lanka, for example, it's a very common conceit in inscriptions, in Katikavata, these kind of, for the king to basically trace his genealogy to Mahasamata. And to say, not just that, to declare the king to be a Chakravatan, a wheel-turning monarch, and a bodhisattva. So all of these things, so basically the idea is that, the Buddha and this genealogy of this king are interlinked. And in the world of the polities of ancient South Asia, genealogy and these kinds of expressions of prestige were politics. Prashasti was politics. And so to that extent, I would say there is this does really exist in a robust way there, but perhaps not in the kind of tradition of political philosophy a la, Western kind of think, Locke or whatever, that we would think about it, at least not according to the texts and epigraphy to which we have access. Right? There could be them, there could be things that are not there. The other thing I would say is that whether or not the norm was actually used in this way, the notion of Dhamma, I would say, is an idea of a law that stands above and outside rulers. Right? So literally in the Burmese Dhammasatta tradition, the Dhamma is, and the law is brought to kings from the boundary wall of the universe, where it's written on the universe in letters the size of cows or elephants. Ajahn Chris knows this tradition way better than me, so I'm not telling him, I'm just saying something he knows better than me for inviting him to kind of tell me why I'm wrong. But and whether or not kings actually felt themselves to be limited by Dhamma in this way, I think is a different question. But certainly in the Sri Lankan tradition, with which I'm more familiar, there was no question that the kings were should be agents of and ultimately subordinated to Dhamma in an ideal sense. Again, in a real sense, they used it, like autocrats use appeals to the rule of law. That's the first kind of set of comments I want to make, just about this question of norms in history and the viability or the reality or the kind of presence of Buddhist political philosophy generally. I think I might leave it there and invite the other commentators, actually.
Maybe I'll say a word, Ken, if that's okay. I'll say something first and then turn to Kim. Just not too much, but I actually want to pick up right where Ben left off, maybe the kings were just using Dhamma like autocrats use the rule of law. But I think that autocrats are actually constrained when they use the rule of law. That, of course, it's not constrained like the ideal would ask. But, in my view, and this is contested in Chinese studies, I think law even constrains the CCP a little bit in China in some ways. Their use of law limits their choices, and it's the civilizing force of hypocrisy, as we sometimes say. And there's constraints. They're very hard to see. But that suggests that it is worth looking at how this loyalty, these ideals, which the kings, used to say they're following, what did that do in their intra-elite battles, how were those things used? And I think that's a great question. The other two things I want to say just in reaction to Ajahn Chris, or one is about future work, so it's not really a reaction to him. But I think what is invited here is actually his comments on the Theravada tradition invite for me some intra-Buddhist comparative work. And the way I think about this, and Ben and I are working on an article on this, it's like, think about the giant question as being state-Sangha relations, just like church-state relations. That's a question that's going to come up everywhere, wherever you have a Buddhist kind of actors in society. And over the long history, as Ajahn Chris said, the role of Buddhism has declined. They're no longer the teachers and the doctors. The role of the state has increased secularly. And in some cases, the state completely controls the Buddhists. And we have in our book examples from like China and Vietnam, where obviously there's no, the Chinese manipulation of the Tibetan lineages or the Tibetan reincarnations is perhaps the apex of that, where there's, total control. In the Theravada world, it also seems to me from your comments that, as you said, the royalists have kind of won, but there's probably a little more space for innovation than there would, obviously, than in a country like China. And then at the other end of the intra-Buddhist comparison, you can look at the Tibetan tradition, which were theocracies, where the Sangha took over the state. And that's just interesting historically, and just to think about those dynamics and why we see them in different ways. I'll just leave with a question I'm very interested in, the relationship between all of this and democracy as an ideal. Because, and maybe it's just, we would say orthogonal, it's kind of a complicated word, but they just have no relationship. That, there's constitutions, and then they don't matter much. The written constitution doesn't matter much. The unwritten norms do, clearly. There's obviously an unwritten constitution, limits political power in every society, and especially in Thailand, where the written one doesn't do too much. And, to what degree are these norms, which are informed by Buddhism, among many other things, provide some space for democratic action and rights and protections that we associate with liberal democracy? I think that's kind of like the $100 million question. Maybe there's no relationship at all. We just think about democracy as having nothing to do with those unwritten norms that guide political power. But maybe there's some resources that could be used from those traditions and from the unwritten norms, and maybe they're just inherently repressive because they're so easily manipulated by states. I don't know. It's a question I'm just leaving you all with before I turn to Ajahn Kem, which I'm now doing.
Just to you, I think religion in general, in the original form is more or less anti-democracy, I think, without a big reform. And that's what the Catholic has to undergo, painful, but you have great schism in the 16th century, and Islam as well. That's why you see the rise of study of Islamic and law, Islam and constitution. Buddhism, we never have that moment where you feel that you have to undergo a reform and try to be more liberal or more friendly to democracy idea. So that's just my thinking. In my PhD thesis, it can argue both ways about democracy. Yes, currently you see Buddhism as an anti-democratic force, thinking about rights and majoritarian vote and stuff. And Buddhism seems to be against all of this idea. But there's a very brief moment in Thai political history where Buddhism is employed as to support the cause of revolution in 1932, Anicang, so that's impermanent. So the absolute monarchy is in the decay state. Nothing is permanent, so that's why revolution is justified. And when they try to build a welfare state, they use that compassion things that Ajahn Chris mentioned, that is actually you can't wait for Pasian, the next Buddha, to come. You have to make it by yourself. So you have to implement that economic reform to distribute wealth. But there's like a very brief moment, because after that, when Sari took over, you see that those those force, those initiative just withered and gone. But just reflect on my experience working on Buddhism and law and talking about norm. I think that's I mean, instinctively when you say, oh, I'm going to working on Buddhism and law, and people say you have to look into Tipitaka, you look into all those sutra, you know like there's Chakavatina Sutra, you have Akanya Sutra, and all those stuff, and it's like, and people like ask me, I mean, nicely, I know he means well, like, do you need to learn Pali and enroll in Pali language course? But actually that's not where norm in Thailand is. I mean, actually, and that it takes me a year to understand that, like, to study Buddhism and law in Southeast Asia is not about studying Tipitaka because no one read it. I mean, even Thai monks, very few can read the original text. They read the Thai translation of it, and it's like incomprehensible to me. I don't even know how all those like reference system works on Tipitaka. But actually, what relates to the most is the secondary or even tertiary works, something very local, very indigenous. That's why I mentioned Tai Phum Paruang as the source of Barami, because that's where they put all those ideas of Chakavatina Sut and Akanya Sut into that and turn it into a Thai political idea of Barami. And that's the same with the first instinct is like, you have to look into sermons of famous monks, but there's no such tradition, I think, in Thailand. It's very difficult to identify any influential monks apart from maybe Puttatat and to some extent Payutto. But even so, I don't think lawyers read that. What happened is that we learn all these Buddhist concepts not from monks, not from original texts. We learn this concept from socialization and from listening to more senior people. But they are seculars. You listen to like Mopawet Wasi, those people who talk about good and bad and morality. They are secular, but in a way, in the Thai context, they act pretty much like monks because they preach about morality, good and bad things and stuff like. So that takes me some time to understand how Buddhism works in Thailand and where to look for all these ideas. Right? So that's quite challenging because I think, and that might be unique to Thailand. I don't know because the Sangha is always unified under the king's patronage. So in a way, they are subject to the king's control. And that's what I asked Ajahn Niti years ago. What defines Thai Buddhism? And I expect something doctrinal, like some unique belief. No, what he says, like Thai Buddhism is all about like, being subject to the king's control. So that's why you never see the king, the Sangha in Myanmar, in Sri Lanka, where they take a front roles in like advocating for political supremacy, stuff like that. It's always like under a secular control. So there's no two swords theory in Thailand. In Christianity, where you have the God's realm and the worldly's realm. I mean, we have a two wheels of Dhamma theory, where the king like spin both wheels. I don't.
And you also have Loki and Lokuttara.
Yes, but in the end, because the king is considered to be Bodhisattva, or I mean, it's unclear whether he is like the aspiring to be Chakavatin or he is actually Chakavatin because no one dare to rule out that confusion, right? But in the end, the king rules both Lokiya and Lokuttara. The only exception may be King Taksin because he claimed to have to reach Sodaban, and that's where the monks and other aristocrats was very displeased and execute him. But otherwise, other than that, I would say the king, and to a later extent now we are looking, as I say, at the mid-level. So you look at someone who can claim to be in proximity with the monarch physically, like they serve in the palace, they serve as privy council, but also like ideologically and functionally, like the judge claim to be served under the name of the king. Something. So that barami dissipate to these people, and they exercise these preaching and administering works for the monarch as well. So that's my reflection on working in this field, and the other thing is that dissatisfaction with lawyers' wrong assumption about laws and legal reform. I mean, look at legal history, and you have Andrew Huxley, who claimed that east of Ural Mountain, Buddhist legal tradition is an equivalent to Roman's Codex Justinianus to the Western world, and that's like super grand claim about the importance of Buddhist law, when in reality I don't think the Dhammasatra is confined to Southeast Asia, and the influence of Buddhists never reached beyond I would say Samarkand, Central Asia, but never to east of Ural Mountain as Huxley said. But in the Thai legal study, any law student would recall that when you take a class on Thai legal history, you spend a great deals of time on Three Seals Code and all the dispute, and I mean, you guys remember by heart Amdang what? The Chang Lek Luang, and you know that dispute about divorce things, and Pamano Sarajan, you know, he goes to the wall of the universe and come back with Dhammasatra, and that's one thing that makes difference. I mean, in the Western world, when we talk about lex natural, that's a God's grand scheme of things for Aquinas idea, but it's in abstract. That's an abstract idea. Lex humanae is a written one, but Dhammasatra is lex natura in itself. Anyway, and you remember that all of a sudden one day they said, okay, and at the turn of King Rama IV and King Rama V, you haveฬาลงกรณ์legal reform, and after that we have all those codes. And it implies from this class that there's no connection, there's no continuity between the first half of your semester when you spend so much on Three Seals Code, and the second half of the semester where you spend time on Monsieur René Guillon, when you speak of Roland Jacquemin. It's just like completely disconnected. And one assumption is that there's no connection at all, no connectivity. And what I try to prove here is that it's wrong. The hardware is gone. The software is here. You know, there's some Buddhist thinking that goes into all this modern code as well. But that's part of our bad. I mean, we tend to blame everything bad as that we have very bad political culture. I mean, all the constitutional failures because of bad political culture, but we never really discuss what that culture looks like. And we claim that bad political culture is like corruption and stuff like that. But actually, part of those bad political culture is those Buddhist ideologies that we talk about, like good and bad things, and like we never suspect them. They're just like the butler that in the crime scene, like the least suspected, but actually he is a perpetrator. So that's my my reflection and response to both Tom and Ajahn Chris. Thank you.
Do you have any further reflections? No. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much.
Sorry, Ron. If I may just say one other thing briefly, sorry, just to piggyback on Kem. Which is that, I think that there is a slipperiness sometimes when we're talking about Buddhism and constitutional law in the book, which is that actually Buddhism doesn't do anything. And in fact, Buddhism is a neologism, right? If you look at historical Buddhist texts, there's no word for Buddhism. It's sasana or dharma. So Buddhism, and so to think about Buddhism as constraining or Buddhism as enabling or acting it's just a wrong way, I think, to go about any kind of inquiry. And I think what Kem's made a really important point there, which is that, if you want to understand what a particular modern politician means by Rajadharma or Chakravatan, don't go back to the Chakravata Sihanadi Sutta, right? It doesn't matter. Go to what this person is saying and how they're using it, right? So when we're talking about the discourse of Buddhist politics, if you like, it's a hammer. It's like a hammer. You can use it any number of ways, but what's important about a hammer is not what it looks like, but is it hitting someone over the head or is it building a house? So it's the same with Buddhism. Now, that is true, of course, of all normative and ideological traditions, right? Christianity, socialism, Marxism, whatever. But there is, I think, something special about Buddhism that is also worth reflecting on, and particularly in Southeast Asia, and that's the role of the Sangha. That is unique. This role of a full-time, professional, renunciant community who claims authority over and to embody the legacy of the Buddha. And one of the reasons that when I wrote about Buddhism and constitutional law earlier, that I sort of defined it in terms I defined it in part as a project that seeks to systematize and organize the relationship between state and Sangha, is because this is, in my view, the perennial question of Buddhist constitutionalism over time. You have two groups who both claim a kind of legitimacy and a kind of sovereignty over a given polity, and how do you negotiate those relationships? How do you negotiate Annachak, and Dhammachak? How do you negotiate the administration of temple lands and the kind of occupation of those lands? I think the Sangha is in some ways a key here. It's also what distinguishes the Theravada version of this, and the Tibetan version to some extent, from a lot of the East Asian versions, in which monasticism, and certainly celibate, organized monasticism, does not play a central role.
Just a quick comeback on a couple of the things that Ben said, and I agree. If you're looking for the law above law, then of course Dhamma qualifies for that, and particularly because of this dual definition that it has. When we were writing this earlier history of Siam back into the Ayutthaya period, and we were looking for sources that are outside the mainstream tradition, because as everyone says, the problem is we have the laws and we have the chronicles, but we don't have any comeback on them. One of the interesting collections are the Jataka tales, particularly the Jataka tales that grew up locally here rather than just being copied from Indian tradition. And there is this, this Banyat Jatok collection. What is fascinating in there is at the end of the collection there's 10 or 12 stories, and they don't appear in any of the versions except the Siamese one. They don't appear in the Myanmar one and the Cambodian one. And they're all sort of shaggy dog tales, but they always start off with a bad king doing something wrong, which results in the hero Bodhisattva having to go on all kind of quests over the end. And at the end, the Bodhisattva becomes the good king. And the fact that this was written over and over again in this period, the stories are all really basically the same, but got written time. I think you can see it as a way of publicly, monitoring the king. I also think, looking at the way the idea of, and the way that the 10 virtues, the Dasarachatam, came into the tradition in Thailand, in Siam, where I think you can see it sort of creeping in the 18th century at that point. It's not like today, when it is an assertion of the king's morality. It is used first to tell the kings that they ought to be moral, right? Which is very, very different. So, and this is, if you like, tam dhamma functioning in a rather different way. Yeah.
Further reflections? No. Okay. Thank you, and thank you very much for all the fascinating presentations. We have learned about a lot about the influence of Buddhism on constitutionalism, and how constitutional law shapes Buddhism, and also we can see how the two elements intermingle as well as conflicts. So now we got a lot of we have plenty of time for questions and answers. So if anyone have questions for our presenters, you just turn on your microphone and please go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, just one thing for those who listening through Facebook Live, that they can type and we deal with question later.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So is it long? Apart from asking question, I would like to take this chance to verify my understanding and from the speakers. First of all, it's a fantastic sharing. I learned a lot. I think it offers a amazing approach for outsider to understand Southeast Asia. It's amazing. And circling back to what Tom mentioned, the relationship between Sangha and the nation, right? We see like in East Asia, probably the extreme case in China, you see the secular power fully brought the religion power under control, right? You see even party units in Southern Temple, right? But in the other end, let's see the case in Myanmar, right? You see the government tried to do that because Buddhists as an important political force that may be capable in challenging the secular power. So they want to bring it under control, but at the same time, you see they need to embrace it or even align with it. You see Myanmar need to did a go to Russia together. They need to show up together. The political leaders need to have religion leaders blessing in order to secure their power. You see like the previous Yangon minister Pheu Minh Danh, he showed up in more in religion events more than other events to secure his, even to please his voters, right? And I think that's just so interesting. And Ben mentioned Unu, right? Unu used to teach Buddhism in northern Illinois, right? He himself is an expert. On YouTube, you still can find one video, his conversation with the Prime Minister of Israel on Buddhism. That's so interesting. And I want to share one of my personal experience to show how this Buddhist practice present in modern daily life law. Right, I was in a project of land transaction for monastery in Burma, right, and then I learned that the law is dual. Like for religion life, monks are not allowed to handle money issue, so the monastery cannot buy the land. They can only take donation. But in reality, there's a purchase, there's a commercial transaction, but you can buy it. That has to be a donation. And I found it so interesting, like even in 21st century, the religion practice still hugely affect the daily life, right? And so we see like not always the secular power wins over the religion powers actually. You see sometimes, even today, sometimes probably that's the other way around, right? Like, thank you so much. A little bit sharing.
Any further questions? Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for your insightful. I have a lot of curiosity, but although I have not yet read your book or even have to purchase that later. So, like, my question might be, a bit vague, but somehow I'll try to get on the track. In general, like, the philosophy of law and religion do intersect, or they do come together at some point. And so the constitutional law in comparative, like, on comparative centrality, on the centrality of norms and practice. So what do monks in generally think according to their cultural diversity and ideas, which can be taken beyond the chapter? Okay, so do Buddhism really shapes themselves? And so I just want to get a little bit more of insights. That's all I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you both for the comments and the questions. And if I understood you correctly, you're asking about this interesting dynamic of how constitutional traditions actually shape Buddhist monks and Buddhist monasticism. This is actually a really interesting question. So, sorry, yeah.
I want to add a little bit, like, if you could make some like a transitions, like, there's a problem happening, like when you mentioned about the Myanmar and Sri Lanka, the Buddhism, tends to be violence, which actually it needs to be like, it's thought to be like peace, meditation, etc. So if you can give some thoughts, like, which can shape a better Buddhism, and also like take it beyond and let them educate a little bit more in the constitutional way. Thank you very much.
Right, so there's also a sort of a normative side to your question, which is it possible to educate monks about liberal constitutionalism such that they could reform the most, problematic aspects of their behavior? This thing about Buddhism and violence is a very important issue, and something I've written on a little bit with Matt Walton, and Michael Jerrison obviously wrote about this. There's a literature out there on this. But this question of, if I may just start with the question of how constitutional law and constitutional practice influence monastics. This is very interesting. I have a current project right now which looks at the monastic legal system in Sri Lanka. And looks at the interaction between monastic law and state law. And there's two things I think that are worth mentioning there. One is to say that there is a full-blown monastic legal system in a lot of parts of the Buddhist world, with courts and appeals and pleadings and judges. And from one point of view, this system is very much influenced by public law and by the sort of contemporary legal system, right? So it's not a coincidence that the structure of courts, that the actual archives, the material evidence of these proceedings look a lot like contemporary court cases. So if you go to Sri Lanka, if you talk to a monastic judge, they'll have like a manila folder, a legal page size, with the case, and they use language that's very close to and sometimes identical with modern legal language, right? So there is a direct, and having attended some judicial trainings, having spoken with a lot of monastic judges, they talk about the Constitution. They call the law that governs their Nikaya Vyavastava, which is Constitution. Same word, and the analogy is purposeful, right? So it's not just that Buddhist monks are influencing the national constitution. The national constitution is the prestige idiom of law of our time, right? So religions are adopting constitutions as well. That's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make, though, is that in the Vinaya, there are legal structures that look very much like contemporary state legal structures. There are notions of convictions and penalties and punishments and the proper way to adjudicate cases. The word for a court case in Pali is adhikarana. That same word is the word is used for contemporary courts in Sri Lanka, right? So and the structure of adhikarana in Vinaya is a two-party system, adjudicated by a third. It looked, Martin Shapiro could have written about Adhikarana. Now, this is exactly the complexities that we've been dealing with in this book, right? So does that mean, A, that the modern legal system in Sri Lanka is an outgrowth of this Vinaya system, or B, that the Vinaya system is like the reshaping of, the adoption of, Western legal norms into monastic practice? It's neither, right? It's this third kind of amalgam. It's this complex. There is an intercultural mimesis there that is just astounding. And it's really made me, it really made me think about the sort of bi-directional or multi-directional complex nature of the constitutional Buddhist interactions, right? Now, regarding your question about normative change, I think that's very interesting, because when it comes to disciplining monastic behavior using the languages of, say, religious freedom, fundamental rights, rule of law, constitutionalism, in a lot of cases, the very monks who you would hope to modify their behavior, they will say to you almost immediately, that's Western, that's not Buddhist, you're trying to kind of, impose a colonial project onto us. Even though the Buddhist tradition has its own nidhitam, it's got its own, in a lot of cases, it's got compassion, right? So there is a kind of opportunistic, there's a kind of a strategic, instrumental, political use of the idea of West and East that comes from the monastic community. When it makes sense to see these things as flowing together and harmonizing, they're very happy to say that they do. When it makes sense politically to say, hang on, this is a colonial Western interventionist project, they do that. Right? So from a kind of a descriptive point of view, it's neither one nor the other.
Can I follow up on that? If you're a monk in Thailand today and you were subjected to discipline, you don't get the due process that you would get in court, even though you're a citizen of Thailand. And, if the Constitution was truly supreme, you probably should. So that's a kind of interesting dilemma there. And it leads to this, the reaction to say, oh, that's just a bunch of Western procedures, that are being introduced. I bring this up because it goes to the question of how one would get to a better Buddhism or a constitutional Buddhism. When we say that Western law came out of religious law, we're basically talking about the procedures. It was the Catholic Church had all these procedures for governing its own, monks, if you will, but also the property they owned, and they applied this law to ordinary people who were subject to their jurisdiction, and that's what became, was brought by Western law. I don't know, because we don't know what procedures were used in 300 years ago in monastic cases, and whether there would have been a similar process which could provide the grounding for a modern claim that these things really had a Vinaya origin rather than a Western origin. I don't know. It's a kind of interesting mystery. If we could go back and magically, like you do, read between the lines, it'd be a really interesting project to try to reconstruct. In terms of the substantive ideals, if we wanted a true Buddhist constitution, there are, of course, I said, a couple people working on this, like the notions of justice and equality, which is a very Buddhist idea, really, when you think about it, because it's available to everybody that, enlightenment can be, at least the Mahayana side. There's materials to reconstruct and to make a more Buddhist governance, if you will, a good Buddhist governance. But the institutional side, I think, is really hard. That's one that we don't have the kind of materials, and every country is living with forms that were determined by Western, colonial contact. We're all in that position. And so I think if I was a follower of socially engaged Buddhism, or I wanted to create better institutions, I would be working both within the law to try to make it better, but also outside the law to try to, to spread ideals and to work at the level, if you will, of politics to change and get a better society that was more consistent with Buddhist ideals. I want to say one last thing about violence, and then I'll stop. As I understand it, Ben knows better, but the Buddhist monks who engage in violence or lead violence in Myanmar, in Sri Lanka, there's two interesting things about that. First of all, it's not new. They started in both countries in the colonial period. They were the violent actors leading resistance against the British. But as I understand, there's a doctrinal justification, which is to postpone the inevitable decline of the tradition after 5,000 years. And so that's kind of interesting. There's a human intervention to try to prevent that. And so that's fascinating. I don't know how one internally rebuts that, or maybe, that must be an internal conversation, I think, which outsiders can't really hope to intervene on.
Just would add one thing to what Tom said about this defense of the sasana logic in these violent movements, which is that, I once wrote an article about religious freedom, Buddhist ideas of religious freedom. And one of the fundamental differences I kind of hypothesized between the Western ideal and a Buddhist ideal is that Buddhism is not like an entity that can exist just in its own isolated place aside from the state. The sasana is in its state of decline. It has to be actively supported by the state to flourish. So unlike the Christian model, the kind of Madisonian model of kind of a totally separate church existing totally separate from government, that kind of thing is not desirable in the sort of Buddhist framing of things.
I mean, my experience with the Sangha is quite limited, but I think we are impact on that colonial mentality as well, although we never been colonized. One criticism by senior monks, you hear it all the time from Buddhist intelligentsia as well, that they recall like those symbiosis between like Anajak and Puddhajak, and that's how they assume that's why Buddhists flourished so much in the last century, and the decline is caused by democratic revolution in 1932. That's when that symbiosis start to like further apart, because there's no king. It's just like civilian government, and so that kind of mentality leads the Sangha to reject almost anything modern, I would say. There's tons of theses on comparative study of modern ideas and Buddhism idea. There's like Nititam, rule of law, constitution, human rights, but it's all fall to the very same pattern, very apologetic pattern. Like they look at the Western thing. That's nice, but it's man-made, and it's concerned only an external aspect of things. So actually Buddhism is superior because it's finer, it goes into your heart and mind and control, even like not just your behavior, but that thing. So you see that kind of recalcitrance, resistance, make it very difficult for Buddhists to make any change, because they see all these things as like being imposed by foreign ideas, foreign legacies. I don't know, but that's my very limited exposure to the Sangha, and they're pretty much like just like that.
Further questions? Yes.
Hello. So first of all, thank you for all the speakers for these interesting topics. And I also have a lot of interested in Buddhism in general, and also in its relationship with law. And as I encounter like the response as Ajahn Kim Tong did, like people ask me, oh, do you want to be a monk or something? but that's the point, because I can't, because I'm a woman. So as we have kind of established that there is a relationship between constitution and Buddhism, so I would like to ask opinion from the panels. Is that relationship somehow affect the position of women in politics? Yeah. Or in social as a whole? So just throw out the question.
Just one thing I would say. Sorry. Okay. That's a very good question. Thank you. The role of gender here is absolutely important. Let me answer your question with a story. which is a court case that happened recently in Sri Lanka. I can send you something I've written about it if you like. People will be familiar that in Southeast Asia there's a movement to establish a bhikkhuni order, right? And there's complex reasons that we can talk about as to why historically the Thai, the Mahathera Samakon and the other kind of official sanghas, establishment sanghas in the region have not allowed it to happen. But we know historically there was, the fourfold community was monks, nuns, laymen, and laywomen, and bhikkhunis were absolutely essential to early Buddhism, right? In Sri Lanka, there are orders of bhikkhuni, but they're not given official recognition by the state. They can't get ID cards, for example, like that monks can get. The Sri Lankan constitution has a chapter on fundamental rights that includes a chapter of equality under the law. A few years ago, a couple of members of this bhikkhuni order made a fundamental rights petition to the Supreme Court, which has original jurisdiction over fundamental rights, basically saying that, asking the court to compel the office that issues ID cards to issue them with an ID card saying bhikkhuni on it, because they refused to do that. The case was given leave. Submissions were filed. On the one side, submissions from the bhikkhuni order and supporters. On the other side, letters written by the kind of establishment sangha in Sri Lanka. The case was given a hearing date, and it was never advanced. The date kept getting deferred, and as far as I know, it's still on the docket but not processed. Now, what does all this signal, right? On the one hand, it signals the fact that actually constitutional law has opened up new spaces for the reformation of Buddhism in Sri Lanka. That is undeniable. I mean, I basically wrote an article to that effect. Not just bhikkhuni, but other forms of Buddhism that have been, more popular in origin or not mainstream or whatever it is. But it also illustrates that the courts have no appetite to adjudicate this. It's a double bind, right? It's a no-win situation for the courts. So what do? They evade. And this has happened in a number of court cases over the course of, and why? Because that question of does the Constitution trump Vinaya or does Vinaya trump the Constitution, no one wants to answer that. That's the million-dollar question. If you answer that, you answer the question, who wins, state or society, state or sangha? And that's the question that you cannot answer. Now, Thailand has its own solution. The state says, we're going to identify, support, and kind of patronize an official sangha, and they'll handle all the Buddhist stuff. But even there, you have your own version of deferral and evasion, over questions of what happens when this official sangha can't fully co-opt or bring into the fold certain movements. What happened, what about Meiji? What about, Wat Dhammakaya, So this is the conundrum that, the answer to your question is yes, it's a conundrum. But I tend to feel that the growing presence of Buddhism in constitutions actually has this interesting unexpected effect of opening up questions of orthodoxy and actually maybe undermining some of the very conservative tendencies that gave rise to those clauses in the first place. Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer.
This issue of the extreme masculine bias in political power in Thailand is a very curious thing, given the significant presence of women in the economy and in sort of all aspects of the society. Yet when you come to politics and questions of power, whether you're talking about the number of MPs, which has never been above 15%, which is quite extraordinary, or you go down to village officers or even to people being elected by local government bodies. It's less there, but this bias still holds. So your question whether this is somehow also related to the male monopoly on monkhood is a very interesting suggestion. I have always tended to assume rather it is a hangover from the extreme male bias of kingship and monarchy, not only in the sense, obviously, the monopoly on the ability to succeed and the almost complete absence of women from the history of the monarchy in Thailand. You only have bad women, you only have Sudachan and so on. But not only that, the extreme male bias in the kunang, in the traditional bureaucratic hierarchy, where the only women that appear are the female servants who are looking after the palace. That's the rest of them are completely male. But I think there's a suggestion that there is also a monastic side to this. It's very interesting. Yeah, thank you.
I'm not sure, but I think it's always big adjudication and negotiation going on when you have religion and constitution coming together. Just your question just remind me of Israel's experience with their constitution. I mean the description that Israel is a Jewish and democratic state. So there's a big wrestling about what does Jewish mean. The debate is still ongoing. Anyway, I mean, in Thai case, I think the difficulty is that the state tend to give the Sangha the total authority over all these issues. So I mean, in Sri Lanka, there's a space for court case and just to try to litigate the issue. In Thailand, it's more difficult because the way we use the law, I think all the monastic issue is outside of the administrative court's jurisdiction, so that's just shut the door for any litigation issues. That's just my addition to Ben's comment.
I thought that was interesting that Kem brought up Israel. I was just there last month, and it's a kind of interesting thing. I think the history of actually Judaism is that when there's innovation in the religion comes from times of crisis, and there's been many movements to modernize many things. But once you have a state, then there's an official rabbinate, and they're very repressive, and they always give that power to more extreme and conservative people, and there's actually a new government that could go very far down that road. And that leads to lots of fights. Can women ride the buses? Do they have to go to the back of the bus if there's a religious person? And the courts have to deal with it. So the general lesson, I think, is that it's back to Madison to me. The separation of church and state is actually kind of important as a normative matter, because when they're connected, it corrupts both of them. That's a general statement. Not about Thailand, but in all countries, I think that's something we observe. But that. At the same time, even in those states, there's always places where there's innovations happening. And to me, and I'm such an outsider to Thailand, but when I see the decline of people going into the monkhood over the years I've been coming here, it's really very, very stark. From my first visit, I talk to young people, no, I would never think of going into the monkhood. That's what a lot of young people say. Well, to me, that's a kind of crisis for the religion, not for the society, but for the religion. And when there's a crisis like that, they have to adjust somehow, or they're going to become completely irrelevant and like a museum religion. And so that could be a kind of lever or an angle to open up some space for better gender balance and equality.
And I would just add, and certainly I think you're seeing changes because of that, right? That I understand now you can temporarily ordain as a woman in Thailand. Maybe it's with Mechi. Certainly in Burma, there's temporary ordination for women. If there's vitality and excitement and enthusiasm and support in Buddhism in a lot of parts of the Theravada world, it's around the women's monastic movements. So yeah. We need Martin Seeger.
He's still here. But I mean, just to clarify on separation, I think what you mean is once you have that separation between church and state, and you have to liberate the church as well. Otherwise, you just delegate everything into another repressive authority, right? That's and the monk. So what should really happen is that, I mean, if you have a dispute with the main sangha about whether you can ordain a bhikkhuni or not, the bhikkhuni should be able to be allowed to form their own order and not be executed for that, right? But right now, if you do that, it's a crime because you are imposing a monk like wearing a saffron robe. So that's I think what separation really means.
Separation is just a very American idea. I'm being very imperialist by suggesting it. But I do think, like, when you look at Sangha regulation in Sri Lanka is very different than in Thailand, very different in Burma. And so maybe that might be a variable that we could look at analytically.
Other questions? Yeah.
Follow up a little bit when you mentioned about the superior of the Buddhism. So like in Thailand, for example, we can think of like, how superior. I can come up with thinking of like how superior the Buddhism should be. It could be like, should they be superior than the king or how? I'm sorry, no insult. Okay, no recording. Okay, so there's another following up next question is like there's a lot of like violence happening between the Buddhism and and also in Hinduism, also in India, you can see like all those like the extremists, like far right, RSS, and so what comes to my mind like should the Buddhism, engage within the constitutions, that given, or they should separate with a separate instrument from the general constitutions, because they are some of this. I mean, due to the a rise of the political motivations that is happening in this generation these days. So, what do you think about the constitution that it should separate in a different instrument, or how it is like?
Can you frame so you talk about the constitution, right? That should and violence, religious violence.
So the constitutions, what I'm trying to say is that like monks, they want to be superior, than the general people, and also at the same time they're very like politically motivated.
Yes,
So should they get exercise the constitution they're given, or they should have a separate one? That's what I mean.
I might just speak from the Sri Lankan case, which is that, so in Thailand Thailand particularly, but, monks can't vote. Monks can't stand for parliament. Monks can't have, official positions and things. In Sri Lanka, a few years, about a decade ago now, no, actually more than that, COVID has warped my sense of time. We had a political party of all Buddhist monks, and they had 11 seats in parliament. There's still monks in parliament in Sri Lanka, so they're very politically active. One of the, I think the study of Buddhism and constitutional law is like a study of double binds, right? These kind of conundrums. One of the conundrums is about the political activity of monks, right? From one perspective, there is a normative position to say that monks should not be involved in political activities. And there are things in the Vinaya, and there's things in other Buddhist texts that maybe suggest that. On the other hand, monks are also charged with protecting the sasana against its inevitable decline, and that's often what they use as the justification for their participation in politics. They are the fourth estate. They are the check on power, the moralizing force on power, the defender of the majority faith. So there is, if I take your question correctly, there's not a clean argument, to be made that monks are forbidden from participating in politics, although from one perspective, clearly that's the case. By the same token, there's not a clean argument to be made that they must or they must not be part of politics, because you see different kind of permutations of this throughout the world. What the extreme, not the extreme, but maybe the limit case is the reincarnate lamas of Tibet, who are embodied both ecclesiastical and governmental power.
I think the Dalai Lama of Tibet might be like an exception to the rule because I mean there's a big crisis in Tibet, right? That's forced him to accept those like non-violence and Western values. I mean, if you imagine Tibet as an independent, autonomous country and ruled by a Lama, you would imagine like, the Lama would behave very differently from the current one. But in case of Thailand, we have a clear separation. I mean, demarcation what a monk can or can't do, and one thing that the monk is not officially allowed to is to enter into politics. I mean, even if you are MP and you get ordained, you're going to be disqualified from MP. Even for ceremonial ordination, just one day and you get expelled from the parliament. Anyway, it doesn't make monks less influential politically. I mean, outside of parliament, they preach. And they preach at local levels. They preach at national level. They have radio stations. So it's less about constitutional demarcation or constraint, but more about how you can de-radicalize these monks. Make them think less about Buddhist supremacy. I mean, they are like super concerned about Buddhist supremacy, and something inherent in Buddhist teaching is that Buddhism gonna last only 5,000 years. So no matter what you try to do, I mean, we are in a state of decline. That very pessimistic thinking, because that's the end point. We halfway through, you know, we are like going down, and things gonna start disappear. So yesterday is always better than tomorrow. That kind of stuff. But at the same time, external issues, the Iranian revolution, the global war on terrorism, makes Thai Buddhism very nervous about Islamic expansion, for example. That doesn't help. Like, they have their own internal crisis. They have fewer people getting into monastery, and they blame it on all these other factors. And their conclusion is they have to be more violent, more competitive to other. To other religions, they have to usurp upon state power. So that just drives things up in Sri Lanka as well, in Myanmar, in a lot of Theravada Buddhism. I think you have to look at Mahayana, and you realize that they don't have such problem for various issues. They survive big crises in Japan, in South Korea, in Taiwan as well, and in China they survive the crisis as well, in different type of crisis, but that make them almost politically harmless. I mean, not the right word, but you know, not very different from what Theravada Buddhism is experiencing.
Can I make just one other observation about these groups and a lot of these, you know, Bodhu Balasena in Sri Lanka, or 969, or the groups that used to be called 969 in Myanmar and whatnot, and that's that there is something I think here that's characteristic of of Buddhism. I was about to say in the contemporary moment, maybe in the last 50 years, which is this, and that's that I think the hierarchies of the establishment sanghas, right? This is the Mahathera Samkhon, this is the Mahana in Myanmar, this is the chief prelates in Sri Lanka, and so on. They have established over the last 100 years a very conservative set of institutions, right? Based on patronage, based on clientelism. Upward mobility depends on going to the right schools, getting the right preceptors, getting the abbotship of the proper temples, rubbing the people the right way, and all the rest of it. And young monks are also interested in careers, particularly if they're going to make a career out of the Sangha. And for monks who don't enter into those prestige pathways in the Sangha, there are very limited opportunities for them to have a livelihood, or a livelihood that's, comfortable. And one of the pathways that some of these monks have chosen has been to start groups. And some of those groups are nationalist groups, right? So Bodhu Balasena, to some extent, these are entrepreneurs who are in some ways responding to issues or taking advantage of issues, but in some ways are responding to a the crisis of the Sangha, a crisis of upward mobility in this case. I did a big survey of Buddhist monks before COVID, and asked some some questions which you could take, I guess, as are the proxies for are they sympathetic sort of forms of Buddhist nationalism, and maybe unsurprisingly to people here, the monks who were most expressive of that opinion tended to be younger. And there is a way in which these groups are attracted to the younger monks, I would argue, this is just totally a hypothesis, because some of the pathways of upward mobility are limited for them. Right? And that's not just true. So the violence thing is one strategy. Other strategies are economic. Right? There are, particularly in Tibet or in Sri Lanka, there are new forms of Buddhism associated with sort of prosperity gospel and all the rest of it, which offer alternative pathways outside the traditional Sangha structures for monks as well. So Buddhism is changing, and it's changing in these ways in part because of the conservative nature of the establishment Sanghas to date.
It might not be fair to compare a Mahayana country with a Theravada country, but Taiwan is a really interesting case. The most religion is complicated in Chinese societies, but the statistics say that the plurality of Taiwanese are Buddhists. That is the biggest single religious group of following, biggest single group. And there's no state control. It's totally free. And there's so much innovation. There's all kinds of, cults and weird things going on in Taiwanese Buddhism. But the point is, it's a very vital place. And I guess it's an open question whether a Theravada place with the Sangha could be freed and could experience that kind of innovation in theory or in practice. It seems to me in theory it is quite possible.
Definitely. So I would just also add that although those are the monks those monks get a lot of news, there's a lot of monks who totally disagree with that as well. And a lot of the monks that I've worked with in Sri Lanka, I mean, there's this kind of vicious cycle about it in which the monks that are kind of most liberal and kind of critical of that sort of thing are also tend to don't want to make public statements, right? So they're not the ones getting news headlines.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Okay, sure. No. Okay, so as I say, this is the beginning of a very beautiful journey. But I talk about the peak in the first round of Buddhism, study of Buddhism and politics in Southeast Asia and stuff like that. And this is, well, we can say this is the beginning of another peak, perhaps. So I don't know. So the question is like, what's next? I mean, this is just the beginning for sure. This is not like the final outcome of this journey, right? So what can be done more and could be done more and for the project on Buddhism and contemporary law? I don't know.
Yeah, we're looking at you, yeah. I think your comment about this is in a way Sangha state and Buddhism and politics like by another name. That was very perceptive, I think. Yeah.
That wasn't meant to be critical, right? I mean, because I was saying that linking these two together it took it on to another stage. I must confess, I mean, I read the book very quickly, and skipped quite a lot of the non-Theravada stuff. But I was very struck by your readiness to go so broad, to take in Mongolia and everything like that, and therefore go beyond the simple question of what is the influence of Buddhism on politics, basically, which is sort of lurking behind it, and pulled out. But yes, I guess the other thing I would say, which is the point of my starting with Tambaya and ending with compassion, is, that did strike me that the whole kind of warm and cuddly side of Buddhism had somehow got left out.
Yeah.
Question. In Thailand, I believe starting with the Constitution in 1997, I'm not sure, maybe earlier. There is a word, interesting word, very important in the preamble, which is the reason why this and this and this need this Constitution, and is a very, how to say, well-known word in Thai. Lots of people use it, although we're not sure they use it in the same way with the same meaning. Niti Tham. Niti and Dhamma. Niti in this case, don't think about Sanskrit, think about Thai, is a law. In Sanskrit may be a little bit different. Dhamma is Dhamma, as you argue, you raised it. I mean, the panelist raised it a moment ago. It seems like the place of it is not clear. I think the place of it is supposed to be quite clear. Quite clear doesn't mean that unequivocal. Quite clear means it's prominent, like the word Niti Tham. What is the role of the word? Well, the question should be, is there any kind of similar word in other Buddhist countries? Doesn't need to be exactly Niti and Dhamma, but somehow the word Dhamma play a prominent role as a legal concept, as a legal term. The question is, other countries, any word, but if I can make a suggestion, I think perhaps we try to unpack not only its meaning, but its role, its place, its development. Maybe we find the place of Buddhism in the Constitution.
How do they translate rule of law in Sri Lanka?
Needy Palanaya, I think. Needy Palanaya, maybe? But needy is there. So there's an interesting situation when I ran this survey where I wanted to ask monks about their attitudes to monastic law and state law, right? And so Raja Nidya is state law. So Niti is there. And I mean, that's easy. That's a kind of easy one to say. But I did a whole bunch of piloting, and it was very important, pilot these like small, because actually the concept of like what is monastic law is actually, it's not Vinaya. Vinaya it just means discipline, it can mean practices, it can mean, it can mean the text, although you'd probably, you would have another word. And the formulation we ended up coming up with was Vinaya Nidhi Saha Sampradaya, which is Vinaya Nidhi, because that somehow adds the specification that what we're talking about is written, it's formalized, it's standardized, it's official. Nidhi has that kind of sense. Saha Sampradaya, distinguishing it with tradition, Sampradaya. So like customs or whatever, but also Theravada is a Sampradaya. Right? These are all, of course, from Sanskrit words. So it's very interesting, I think, that nititam, the other word, I think, if we sort of hone in more on the words that are used for law and rule of law, the other one that always strikes me in Thai, I don't speak Thai, but ratatamanun, So is that different from constitution? I mean, it's certainly different from vyavastava. So the word for constitution in Sinhala is vyavastava, which although it has religious resonances and things, there's no Dhamma in there. So I think you're raising a very, this linguistic thing is really interesting. Yeah.
Any further thoughts or questions? Yes.
Not sure if my question is related to the topic, but as I'm listening and someone mentioned about the question of the rule of law, Buddhism and the rule of law, I would like to ask, is there something in the Buddhist thinking which will make it very difficult to establish the rule of law? say in Thailand? Because I was thinking, the idea of the rule of law, that the law has to be applied to everybody. But then you can't apply to someone who is incarnation of Buddha, for example. And the idea of reincarnation, and you not only have this life, but you have life after your death. And if you are not punished now, you can be punished in your next life. And so it doesn't matter if we don't have rule of law. I mean, what do you think of that? If that is the case, then it would be very difficult, isn't it, to establish, so it defined the basic principle of democracy, isn't it? How to do about that?
It's my work anyway. So go back to I think the rule of law. The first thing is there's a sanctity of law in it. I mean, written law, and I think it starts in Europe. You can think of the great investiture conflict in 11th century, and that's like when the Pope and the Emperor has a conflict over investiture power, to appoint ecclesiastical priests, and what they do is not to make war, to wage war, but it's actually they turn to lawyers. Like the church has its own bunch of lawyers studying lex canon, and the emperor also look for lawyers to justify his power of investiture over the church as well. So actually the great investiture conflict spur the study of proper Roman laws in Europe, and that's why they have faculty of laws and university across Europe. We don't see that here. I mean, the notion of written law is still inferior to Dhamma. I think that's one thing very clear. Yeah, definitely the idea of karma is a better law doesn't help. I remember when the son of Kun Chalerm Yu Bamlung was accused of shooting the policeman in a pub, and he was on the run, and Chawalit Yongchayut was a prime minister there, and he gave an interview saying that there's a law in Thailand, but if we couldn't catch him and we couldn't prosecute Kun Chalerm's son, we still always have the law of karma for him in the next life. So that kind of mentality, I'm not sure what caused which, because maybe the legal system is so bad that we have to depend on karma, or the karma is there, and that's why our legal system is always bad, because we have a leeway of not enforcing it, but it's there. But no, the element of rule of law is complex. You need equality of man, and we are living in the society that's very hierarchical. We need a sanctity of written law, and we are living in the society that regard Dhamma as more superior, and we tend to put an interpretation of Dhamma in one man or a more senior, never a discuss. I mean, Buddhist Dhamma is very unrefined in that sense compared to Christian philosophy. For example, in the principle of violence, there's a talk about just war, justa causa. There's debate over many centuries on finally how Christianity could employ violence, in which manner and for what cause. We never have that. I mean, we have King Washiravut composing Thamma Songkram to justify entering to the First World War, and no monks ever voiced any objection. There's one monk, จ้าคุณอุบาลี, voiced objection on joining the war because he said, as a Buddhist, we shouldn't kill, and he got demoted right away. So that's how the Anajak overcome Puthajak in interpreting Dhamma to support political cause. And if you still have that structure, if you still have that belief, it's very difficult to establish rule of law in case of Thailand. Thank you.
I think it's a kind of a general question. I'll just say, Islam struggles with this too, even because, of course, there's divine law which no human can constrain. But one factor which I think pushed the Islamic empires to get to the rule of law was they were pluralist. That is, even in Islam, when it was an empire, a definition of an empire is you have lots of different peoples living there. And of course Islam was on top, but they had to deal with Jews and Christians, and that required some structure for predictable rules to interact across those divides. And, at an ideological level, the Theravada societies haven't grappled with their own pluralism. That's most obvious in Myanmar, where it's not really a Buddhist country, but maybe that would be, again, kind of, if you're thinking about this as a normative project, how do we go theorize? What would a Buddhist rule of law look like? We'd say, well, what did Buddhism say about treating non-Buddhists? And what are the things that they can rely on? Do they just have to rely on the mercy of the king and their personal loyalty? Or can they expect some kind of predictable structures in institutions?
If I might just add one thing, in response to that really great question. I mean, David and Jarwan Engel's work on this is really interesting. That book, Tort, Custom, and Karma. And basically, his conclusion is sort of what you said, that in Chiang Mai area, in La Na, it's karma that matters more than state law.
It's even more than that. You can get pardoned. You can request a pardon. If you are high government officials, you can request the pardon and they get it. And the person is absolved completely.
But not karmically absolved.
Yes, please.
So first, I would like to say thank you to all the panel of guest speakers because I'm really obliged to be here and as you honorable guest speaker know, I'm only a third-year student, so my questions may be perplexing and because all of my thoughts tangle up inside. But I would like to know, the thing is that you say about the unelected agencies and the elected agencies, which may be assert about their barami or some of their great power, but there is no exact imposed regulation that impose on them to prevent them from further actions like political actions or something. And the thing is that they only rely on their morality. And when it's come to these problems, I think both the loyalist side and the coup side also has their own notion of Buddhism inside them, because the loyalist movement, they assert that they deploy constitution on behalf of the institution of monarchy, but the coup also they employ the Buddhism as the norm to support revolution, they use that compassion to support their revolution, the grief for utter suffering, like that. So my question is, how does the constitution should be amended so as to prevent the assertion of barami and morality on their own without regulation imposed, but still in alignment with Buddhism concept, because both the coup and the royalists still have their Buddhism notion embodied in their actions.
How it should be amended? There's a tricky question. I think even without the influence of Buddhism, in Thai constitutional design, I mean, the whole world, I think, is grappling with the problem of the rise of the judiciary. I mean, in many places in Israel, in USA, but also in other jurisdictions as well. But I think the distinction is they don't see that judges as like as barami people, you know. So they are free. There's more space to criticize the judiciary. There's more space to criticize electoral commission. By in Thailand, if you look at the Thai judiciary, you're gonna be surprised by the way they conduct their life. Because actually, if you look into like those funeral books, you know, หนังสืองานศพ and you're gonna see that the most praised virtues of these senior judges are not their legal intelligence, not their legal abilities, but how they conduct their life, like, just like monks, like sandod, frugal, celebrate, you know, that honesty. So all the, I mean, these are good virtues, but are these good virtues make them a good lawyers? I don't know. Sometimes not. I mean, that's personal virtues. They might not have courage to do the right thing on the bench, but they have compassion when they speak to younger colleagues. I don't know. But anyway, that's what happened in Thai judiciary. They are regarded almost as sacred, and they are above any blame. If you look into the press release of the Thai Constitutional Court in recent years, at the bottom of the press release, there's going to be a line that useful legal knowledge for the public, and they quote the contempt of court, the whole section of contempt of court there. So any attempt to criticize the court is punishable by law. It's a useful legal tip, but they never change that tip. I mean, it's always that legal tip that, you know, you can't criticize us impolitely, that kind of stuff. So to the question of amending the constitution, I don't think we can amend anything in the constitution. It's superficially Western enough. I mean, international, universal enough. What we should try is to change our perception of judges and all these like barami person, and to really understand what they do, and they're just human and they can err, and we should be able to criticize them. What we should amend is the law on contempt of court, really.
So like, thank you for the answer, and I would like to ask further question. Like, so as I understand now, it's like superficial question, and it cannot be answered because we should like focus on the morality of the judges, which is the panel who like exercise the like barami. And I would like to know, like, how can the educational system like to educate the person to become the personal or the judges to like to make sure that the actually I think that there is a hidden norms in the constitution, like some hidden notions in the constitution which is unwritten, and how can we like how can this norm provide like the rules for democratic actions, and if so, what is the relationship between that kind of norms and the democratic actions which should be taught in the law school or other schools, so as to make sure that the judges in the future will be able to like analyze the cases in alignment with the Buddhism and like hidden norms.
There's a book by Duncan McCargo on fightings for virtues, and I think if you read the first 3 chapters of the book, you understand the making of judge, how the narrative, like the struggle, the great struggle, all the intelligence and all the praise, and and you understand better how they construct their identity, and that might provide some solution to your question. I mean, of course, I mean, we always come back to legal education. Can we do something with legal education? Can we inject some like more values into it? Definitely yes. I mean, it's not in my area anymore. I'm not here, no longer here. But Ajahn Ravin and but there's a talk in legal education on how we should diversify the choice. I mean, I think right now it's very unhealthy that we have a Thai bar oriented curriculum, and that's like subtly nudge you to that kind of thinking about like the judge at the Senate of everything. But yeah, there's a talk about reform. I don't know what happened with Munin's attempt for reform. It's bitter.
So we got only 5 minutes left. So perhaps we can have one final quick question. Anyone? So can I ask a question myself? No. Oh yeah. Yes. So final question.
First of all, I would like to thank you all the panels. I'm also a third-year law student as my friends. So my question is, Thailand is as we know, is a religious country. So we have religious constitutionalism. But I don't think it's fair to other beliefs, to other people who believe in other religion. So in my understanding, that's why we also have like the set of rules that applies to like the province in southern, like. So I believe that who controls the beliefs control the people. That's why Thailand is written in Buddhist constitutionalism. So I tend to believe that rule of law is the rule of law, is the rule of nature. The beliefs is not the nature itself. It's a set of beliefs that nature should be this, but people have different views. But the truth can always be one truth. So I would like to ask that in like 100 years ago, in Western country, they also have like countries that apply the belief like Christianity into the constitutionalism, to their laws, to their rules, and then we skip to the present. Those countries in like Europe, America, they have a constitutional that based on the people needs, based on the justice itself. So my question is, what can we do, especially in Thailand? What can we do to shape ourselves, shape our laws, shape our beliefs in people, in the law that can be like those Western countries that their laws, their constitution is based on what people need, what people deserve the justice.
May I start? So, first of all, I'm not sure that the Western constitutions are much better at this in practice. There's a big debate, of course, in my country about the limits of the written constitution, which is just about what the government can't do and doesn't say anything about what the people actually need. And so many people want to rewrite it. I think one general point, very surprising to most people, is that the majority of the world's constitutions do provide a privileged status of one religion. And it's not just Islamic countries or Buddhist countries, but now we see in Europe, many of those very old constitutions would say the king has to be a Lutheran in Norway. And so there's always this kind of subtle preference, and sometimes much larger than that. But there's, in many countries, a subtle preference for one state, for one faith. And then, of course, all societies are plural now, and more so all the time. And so that's a challenge. How do we grapple with the fact of pluralism is a general challenge we're seeing in lots of constitutions. You asked about, I want to say something to the prior question very briefly, which is, what can we do? I think, of course, in law school you learn legal ethics, what you as a lawyer have to do for your clients. But one of my things about my own country is no one teaches anyone real basic ethics, like, don't lie, cheat, and steal. Like, that's not taught in schools, or how to treat, just basic things. And so that's a way to a better society where we think about others, and this notion of compassion as being a kind of a root value, which we could, celebrate more in thinking about the other person, which would, if more people did it, change our public policies and our constitutional law. I want to say a last thing, just because I'm not going to probably be able to speak given the time is running out. This book, one of the things which we did, which I've never done before, is this book is actually free. Every one of you can get it online, electronically. So I encourage you, if you found it interesting, you can go to the Cambridge website and look up our names, and you can see the book there. So that's a new thing that we're trying to do to get more, something like this, where it's of interest not just to lawyers, we hope, but to, Buddhists and in all kinds of society. So that's just an advertisement, a brief advertisement before I turn to my colleagues.
So I just want to make, first of all, thank everyone for this wonderful panel, and just to answer Kim's comment that I don't think we did before about where to next. And I want to make a very kind of modest suggestion to the law school here, which is that I hope, and I think the next step, one of the next steps that I would like to see taken is to have more conversations where you have people, historians, sociologists, anthropologists, Buddhist studies scholars, come and talk with people at the law school and open up some of the boundaries between our disciplines. I think that one of the most exciting and fun parts of this has been that. And then if you can do that, maybe a center for Buddhist law, and then Tom and I can come and we can run that center, and then we'd stay here. It'd be amazing. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. It's 12 o'clock now. So thank you very much for all the participants and attendants. And so now is the end of the seminar, and so let's have lunch. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.